The rise of polygon-based games enchanted gamers with a third dimension. Traditional 2D platformers virtually vanished. Are the small handful that made it worthy of our time? Welcome to Sega Saturn SHIRO, the only podcast that squashes polygons into creamy 2D goo.
Welcome to Sega Saturn SHIRO. Your hosts today are, well, there's actually quite a few of us, so I'm going to go through the introductions. We're going to start with the two originals, the OGs, the genuine articles, often imitated but never duplicated. We've got Trainoco Pat and Saturn Dave. So good day, gentlemen.
How's it going?
Good day,
I'm ready for some good hot steamy gex.
I'm an OG, an OG, an original OG.
Tinkering with consoles and restoring arcade cabinets, he even programs in ancient computing languages. Our very own beast from the East, Ben. Hello, Ben.
Hello, everybody.
And finally, there's me, recently found in the Great Canadian North and subsequently thawed. I basically sweat maple syrup. I am your Canadian connection, Peter. So, welcome, everybody. Let's just do a very quick, roundtable to see how everyone's been doing and what they've been up to. And why don't we kick it off with you, Pat?
Just doing a lot of gex.
Have you been having a lot of gex lately?
Yeah, I'm all about that gex. Like literally, I wake up and gex. Go to have some breakfast and gex. Have some lunch. Have some nice gex. And go to bed and have some nice steamy hot gex. There's just gex all the time. I just can't get enough of it.
I'm very happy for you. It's definitely, life is better with a lot of gex. Do you usually play gex by yourself?
No, usually usually sometimes it depends on the mood. Sometimes it's good playing alone. Sometimes it's good playing it with doing a trade off every time you die. So it's always a twofer thing, And sometimes you can do it with more than two people, and that's kind of fun. Get a multi-tap and play that.
Oh my gosh, that's wonderful. Thank you very much for sharing.
No, jokes aside, I've been doing pretty good. Got kind of sick, so my voice is kind of messed up, but I've been pretty good. Just playing a lot of Warhammer, like I talk about on the podcast. I'm actually going to do that right after this, so I'm excited. Just got my Tau army put together, so I've literally been priming, and I have all these little weapons I've been putting together. So it's been a lot of putting together these little weapons and priming them, and but
dollies.
It's all good. The dollies, yeah. Sorry, I meant dollies. My bad.
Hey, that's all good, man. That's fantastic.
Just good dollies and gex. That's all my life's been about.
What about you, Dave? Have you been having a lot of gex?
I've been having some gex. I have some gex, but Peter, that intro was classic cheese.
It was. It's pure cheese. It's pure cheese.
You laid it on thick. But I've been keeping busy with the podcast. You and me, and then Pat and I did a Dreamcast. Yeah, it was really fun. Keeping busy with the SHIRO show, of course, every week. Fridays, folks can join us and check us out. Been working on articles for the website, just keeping busy, being sick, and gex. But yeah, you could probably hear from my voice that just like Pat, we've both been kind of down in the dumps. But also been playing a lot of Switch, Sonic Frontiers, excellent game, having fun with it. Like I told you, I think you should try it out, Peter. You might like it. Sonic Team. But yeah, other than that, that's me.
Excellent. All right, Ben, over to you.
Oh man, I've been having so much gex. It's been amazing. So, we've been playing a lot of gex. We also just wrapped up Dying Light 2 was something we've been playing as well. I got through that game. It's really a lot of fun. Was playing it on the Xbox, the Series X. Been doing some Switch games. Some of the big news on my end is we're opening up a comic book shop and cosplay shop in Chattanooga, and that we're hoping to have it open within the next 2 months. It's going to be called Myth and Fable Comics and Cosplay. And a lot of people have asked, are you going to have video games and all this good stuff? And I have told them yes, eventually. But we're basically starting with more or less the comic books, the figurines, the costume accessories, costuming pieces. We're even doing costume classes. And then once we get our base going, then we'll start to expand into video games, which is something that I've always wanted to do. But that's the big exciting thing going on our end, and we are all thrilled over here.
Cool.
That is very cool.
Congrats on
That
that.
just, it's, extra motivation for me to get down there and visit you down in Chattanooga and check out your store once it gets going. Like, that is so awesome. It's got to be a lot of work though.
Oh, it really is. Like some of the stuff that we've had to do in the process of getting it going is just stuff you just never think of. Even the paperwork drills, for example, or the types of licenses and stuff that you have to purchase, things like that. It's wild, but at the same time, it's a lot of fun because it's not stressful in the circumstances that you're doing this for, like a fun business. So it makes it a lot more bearable to do those kind of things.
Nice. Okay, and then just finally some updates from me. I think I finally stopped playing Christmas Nights for a little while. We're well past the Christmas season. I'm sure it'll pick up in a few months again. I've been playing some Castlevania Symphony of the Night. I just seem to replay that game at least once a year. I love it so much. And you know what? I have to admit, the only current gen platform that I own is the Switch, and I don't really give it that much time. But there was a demo of a game I downloaded just the other day called Sea of Stars, and boy, do I love it. So that's definitely one that I'm going to eventually pick up and play. But yeah, that's more or less what I've been up to. So welcome everybody to the cast. So the topic today, we're going to be talking about 2D platform games on the Saturn. So if you think about it, the 16-bit era was sort of like the golden age of the 2D platformer. You had Mario, Sonic, Bonk, even, ones like Bubsy and that little red dot thing from the 7-Up logo spot, right? Like they're just all over the place. And I think part of the reason that they were so numerous back then is like the hardware, the 16-bit hardware was kind of limited. Like you couldn't really do 3D properly, so you didn't really have first-person shooters or proper 3D racing games. I mean, there were a few games that sort of did pseudo effects, but none of that stuff would really come to fruition until the 32-bit generation. So during the 16-bit, there was a lot of platformers. And then when we moved over to the 32-bit generation, it's almost as if at the very beginning, there seemed to be quite a lot of them, but they sure petered out as time went on, right? And gamers, to be honest, at the time, like they wanted the new 3D stuff. They wanted the 3D fighting games and the racing games and, the first-person shooters and everything. And so
they really, really wanted Bubsy 3D.
Yeah, there was Bubsy 3. You know what? Yeah, we can't forget that. And then, but that's the thing. Like a lot of platformers went 3D as well, right? Like, I mean, from early efforts like Captain Quasar to eventually there was Mario 64 and Croc and Tomb Raider and whatever. And so really the 2D stuff took a back seat. However, like now that all of that's retro, if you really think about it, those are some of the games that get the most love these days. And the 2D platformers. So we're going to talk about some of them. And just diving right in, we're going to talk about the first one on the list, which is Astal. So Astal was programmed internally at Sega, and it was released in Japan in the summer of 1995, and then eventually in September here in North America. And this game actually did not have a PAL release. So the game is really well known for its watercolor visuals. It took advantage of the Saturn hardware for its excellent color, some of the scaling and rotation effects that you see in the game that weren't really common during the 16-bit era. It's got some tried and true 2D platforming gameplay. The controls are good. Some people maybe find them a little bit awkward. And, just to wrap up the intro, the reviews for the game at the time ranged from mediocre to positive, with the common theme being that, it's a good game, but it didn't really do much to sell the Saturn as like this, next generation platform. So I just want to get some conversation going. What did you guys think of Astal, and did you end up playing it, near its original release time? And I want to maybe start with you, Dave.
I'm going to disappoint you because I actually did not play Astal back when it was released. Like that was not, I don't know why, I mean, like basically at that time I was just starting to work a job. When I got a Saturn, I think I still wasn't working a job, and I was like scrounging money, like odd jobs and stuff like that, and going in on it with my brother, so like money was really tight. Also, just our exposure to the Saturn library was very narrow. We're talking about the loudest things made an impact, like Panzer Dragoon Zwei and stuff like that, were things that hit our radar. But Astal was not one of those games that I ever remember seeing on a shelf, that I ever remember anybody talking about. It's one that I would come to later and enjoy, but it's definitely not one that I was aware of as I want to say, 15-year-old, basically.
To be fair, you probably couldn't even find it on the shelf.
Yeah, I mean, even if it was on the shelf, I wouldn't know what game it was, right? Because there's no spine label.
Yeah, that's true, actually. How did that get past, it must have been an intern that was manning the quality control desk at the time. I don't know, right?
I mean, I'm sure they definitely, when they realized, they're like, okay, that guy's fired.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe somebody accidentally forgot to add a layer into their Photoshop thing, or forgot to unhide it.
Oh, seriously, that's all it was. It's just a hidden layer. Oh yeah, Photoshop layers are probably to blame for most of those problems, like Crusader No Remorse, which has like the logo on top of the stripes, but then the back shadow, like the drop shadow, is behind the stripes, and so it has this weird effect. That's just a layering thing, And honestly, it's funny, like doing repros and stuff, I can kind of relate. Like there have been at least 1 or 2 times early on where I printed a ton of things, just realizing, oh my God, I made a huge mistake, and now I have to like shred all of this and do it again. But to do it on that massive of a scale where they're like, oh well, I guess we have to ship it. To answer your question, I think it's a wonderful game. It's just not one that really hit my radar back in the day.
Okay, and I'm going to come back to you to see what you think of it today, but I'm just going to move over to Ben and see, just check in to see what your opinions of the game are.
Yeah, sure. So I'm similar to Dave's situation where it just was not on my radar back in the day. It was it was just so overlooked because of all the other games that were coming out, all the games that he had mentioned, platformers, things that were loud and, wanting to be known, and these big, great things like Panzer, stuff like that. And, I ran into the same situation. And so I love platformers. I'm surprised I missed this back in the day. But what I ended up doing was, because the spine label was missing, when I'm searching through games out at stores, I'm like, what the heck game is this? Because I don't have anything on it. So I'd look at it. Oh, okay. No, Astal, I don't know what that is. Okay. And then I would do that like 3 times, keep grabbing Astal every time I came into the game store. And for that reason, I was like, let's try this game out. Let's see what this is all about. And I played it, and it was actually pretty amazing. It looks like something that, in my opinion, is what they truly wanted to do with the 32X back with the Genesis stuff. This multi-layering bunch of palettes of colors, beautiful game. And it was a lot of fun to play. It was well-paced. It felt really good as far as how to control it. I really enjoyed it when I actually did pick it up. But it just was not there when it first came out. I just had no idea about it.
Interesting. And I kind of wonder whether that was a bit of a casualty of the fact that the game wasn't a launch title, but it did come out pretty early on. And so there wasn't very much advertising for it. Like, the launch ad campaign featured all the launch games and everything. But Astal was not part of that. And so then it came out during that awkward period just after the launch, but just before the PlayStation launched. So it was kind of, kind of maybe lost in the shuffle, I guess.
I think it's a combination of that and being 2D. Like, it's a casualty of being 2D. Nobody was talking about it because
Yeah.
they were kind of sweeping it under the rug, talking about the 3D games and really featuring the 3D games. As poor as Saturn was doing from a marketing standpoint, only the really loud things got through because we were mostly getting hype for Ultra 64 and then PlayStation, you know. So it's like, if you heard about Saturn at all, like Pat over here didn't even hear about Saturn, and he's not alone. Like,
Nope.
most people didn't hear about Saturn. I only heard bits and pieces, and what I did hear were just the really high profile stuff that got through. So if it was a 2D game that journalists were basically saying, it's fair to middling because it's 2D, they weren't talking about it, so it just didn't get through.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Like, a lot of the reviews of the time were kind of mediocre to okay, but nobody said, hey, this is the best 2D game ever, buy it now. So it didn't get that attention.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on it, Pat?
Bad game. I'm just joking. No, basically the way that I look at it is that I think my favorite thing about that is that it's one of the games where, that whole, like, they make the cutesy Japanese character like rough and tough for American audiences. It's the one time I think they probably did that right, because he actually in the game is pretty rough and tough and, like, a grungy kind of dude, if that makes sense. Like, he's not like the typical cutesy character, which I kind of like. It's one time where the Americanization of the box art, like with they make the character like angry and like mad on the cover, like with all the Kirby games, kind of makes sense, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's one of the few games I don't mind the American box art, to be honest with you. I mean, the Japanese box art is probably better, arguably, but the American box art isn't terrible, like most of the other stuff.
Except for the crime of the missing logo on the spine, of course.
Yeah, well, there you go. Yeah, they had to do that.
Of course.
But overall, I really enjoy the game. It's pretty fun. It kind of really has a PS1 side-scrolling feel to it, if that makes sense. Like, it feels like somebody took it from a PS1 side scroll, like, maybe was it the like Punky Skunk or something like that, or like one of those, like, no budget games, and it's really fun. I can see why it got lost in the shuffle, though, because the way back then, if it's not 3D, it's not getting focus, and like, I don't know, game scores, like, it's kind of funny, middling game scores back in the day, like 2 and 3 out of 10s usually get high praise nowadays, like some of the 2D ones that are out, because back then it's like a different mindset than now, where it's like, you see all these hidden gem things where all these games are amazing and stuff, but you see the reviews like back in the day, it's like, oh, 3 out of 10, 2 out of 10, and stuff like, oh, not 3D or something like that. And this game is definitely a good 7, 8 out of 10 game. It's not bad. It just wasn't, what people were looking for back then, and the times change, and so do views. It's kind of funny how that works. Like, it's kind of, I guess, to analogize it to music, it's like when Pinkerton dropped by Weezer. Everyone hated that album back in the day, but now it's like the de facto Weezer album, if not the best one they've ever written. And it kind of compares some of these games like that. I mean, Astal definitely isn't, the best sounding game of all time, but it's really good. I like it, and it's definitely a 7, 8 out of 10 game for me.
So there was a couple changes made from the Japanese release over to the American one, and it all sort of had to do around difficulty. So the Japanese game, Astal, starts out with 5 hits, whereas it was changed in North America that he only has 3 hits. And the Japanese game also gives you unlimited continues, whereas the North American game, you've got 1 continue. So, it was definitely tweaked to be more difficult. You kind of wonder how much of that was to combat the sort of weekend rentals where people would rent a game, give it a try, beat it over the weekend, return it, and never, buy it, right?
That's exactly why they did it.
Yeah, and that's it, which I understand. Like, I totally get it. Like, these games weren't cheap back then, but yeah, those were, aside from obviously language and whatever, those were really, the only major changes made to the gameplay. But it's an interesting take that you say kind of looks, it's got like a bit of a PS1 vibe. I never thought of it that way, but I think you're right. Like, it's, it seems to have, that brighter color that PS games are kind of known for in spades. So that's definitely there. Dave, I'm going to circle back to you. I'm just curious. So, now that we are in the 2020s, we're long past the time where this is a current game, obviously. How has your opinion of it changed? Like, is this a game that you would enjoy nowadays, that you would pay attention to? Do you think this kind of now falls on this sort of higher end tier of Saturn games, or what do you think?
Yeah, I think that it's a great game. I do. I think that it's kind of special. Like, it's not. This is definitely, to me, I don't see this as like a Bubsy 3D or as like a, budget back alley platformer. Like, I actually see this as kind of like a really special 2D platformer that kind of constantly goes underappreciated or under. People don't really realize how unique and special it is. I like all the graphics, all the art design and everything is very bespoke, is very much like unique to this series. The character is cool. Like, you can pick up these huge trees and like chuck them. It is, the controls initially kind of take a little bit of getting used to, just because it is so different than most, Mario style jump on things, jump on platforms kind of platformer, but it controls fairly well. The art is beautiful. The music is amazing. I'm not just saying that. Like, the music is really, really good. The story, it's got this cute story, and he has to save his girlfriend. And again, the music, like the intro, da 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 da. I think Sega Lord X uses that for his intro. It's really cool. The gameplay is great. I would just say that I think they kind of, so this game came out in April. Okay. Saturn launched early, right? It wasn't supposed to, but it launched early in America, right? Otherwise, I imagine this probably would have been a launch title or close to it, right? Came out in April in Japan, and then it wouldn't come out until the software drought in like August in the West, for the Saturn,
Right.
So, and at that time it was like, there was a software drought. People were complaining about no games for Saturn. Then this drops and it's like a 2D game. And they're like, like, we want more, give us more Panzer Dragoon, or whatever, give us more 3D gameplay. It's supposed to be cutting edge stuff. You give us this 2D side scroller. What is this, last gen? I think people's opinions were fairly negative. And then on top of that, the Western game is brutally difficult. And I think part of that is because of the rental market at the time. As a kid, I always thought that the Japanese version of games were supposed to be harder, or at least that's kind of was my general understanding, is that, Japanese gamers are hardcore and they always have their version be harder. But actually, in this case, I would recommend people play the Japanese version because it's easier. You get more lives. Whereas with this, you only get 3.
Correct. Yeah.
And just some of the platforming difficulty is just really brutal. And so I think that they made it more difficult. This is just my theory, but it's a very common theory, is that at the time, the game rental market was huge, and Saturn was no exception. They would rent out the actual console. I think that's how you experienced the console early on.
Yep.
Blockbuster, Hollywood Video. They would rent out the console with a game or whatnot. And they'd want you to re-rent it, So if you could finish it in one sitting, you wouldn't re-rent the game, So of course they would make these games punishingly difficult. And of course it was illegal to rent consoles or games in Japan. So that market didn't even exist. They didn't rent games or consoles in Japan. That wasn't a thing. So yeah, over in Japan, there was just no need to make it brutally difficult. But yeah, over here, a lot of games during that time period were casualties of being overly difficult just so that they could squeeze another rental out of you.
I mean, it's the reason why The Lion King is so hard.
Absolutely. But yeah, so, and it's also typical for some games, and this isn't the only case, some games that were Western games that were ported over in Japan would kind of have the difficulty toned down. So they were more like balanced, So yeah, I mean, that's the only thing I would say, that if folks want to check it out now, the American version is too expensive anyway, So go for the Japanese version, and I think you'll quite enjoy it. And the only other thing I could say is that I think it's kind of a shame that this never made it to PAL territories.
Agreed. And to be honest, if I compare what's happening in Astal to, what might go on in a typical 16-bit platformer, I mean, it's got, like, to your point, it's got music that you wouldn't really be able to do on 16-bit, and it's got some graphical effects that you just couldn't do in 16-bit. So, rotating sprites. There's a later level later in the game where one of the bosses you're fighting is this like big dragon that's like surrounded by flames, and the gimmick to defeat the dragon is he's got to sort of take in as much breath as he can, and then he just blows, and it kind of
Right.
stuns the fire dragon for a little bit. And like just the pixel art and the huge sprites, none of that would be really possible on 16-bit. And some of the weird bosses, like that weird eye that you have to jump up and hit and grab and whatever. So like, you know, it was definitely a step up from what was possible in 16-bit, and yet, to your point, it was largely ignored because that's not what people wanted at the time. So it's a classic case of, you know, misreading the market, misreading your target audience there. So
I hate it when games are judged based on what they're not, you know. I hate it when and then so many games fell casualty to that during this generation. It was either it was an FMV game, and FMV is out of vogue, so we're not even going to look at it. If it's lunacy, you know, could be the pinnacle of the genre, you know. It could be they reached a point where they had ironed out all of the little problems with the genre, and they'd reached the pinnacle example, and then but at that time, nobody's listening anymore. They're like, oh, you know, we're convinced that, you know, 3D is the future and anything else is just doesn't matter. And this is the same thing. You know, it's like the pinnacle of the genre. Look at Pat's playing the game right now, and it has this amazing parallax scroll where the background scrolls one way and the foreground scrolls the other way to create this kind of rotation effect, you know, with the enemy in the middle. I think Ben wants to say something, though. Go ahead, Ben.
No, what is crazy though is, so we have this big resurgence of game companies and developers that are developing these games in retro format, and on these retro consoles, on PCs, stuff like that. Okay, so imagine if Astal, made today, you know what, 20 years later, was made, just came out of the gate. This is a 2D platformer that was just released on a older console. This thing would be raving reviews. Everybody would love it.
I totally agree.
Wild. Yeah, that just because of the timing that it came out, that, as Dave was saying, as people were looking at things that were in vogue, such as like the FMVs or the platformers or whatnot, and everybody was wanting to see the next big 3D thing. And since this was not that, then this was just kind of quietly set off to the side.
Do similar prejudices exist today? Because I feel like people are mostly graphics agnostics these days. It's just like, if it's an indie game and it's 2D, whatever, you play what's good, right? You know, if it has a good solid mechanic and there's a story, people just don't care that much about the graphics these days, you know?
Well, it depends on who you ask. A lot of people like...
I guess it does.
I heard them knock on, like, I mean, if it's not 60 frames per second, a lot of people throw a fit nowadays.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's not just the polygon count. It's how well it performs. I think that's really, these days, that's the thing. So if it's, you know, Shredder's Revenge, which is 2D, or the Scott Pilgrim game or whatever, it doesn't matter if it's 2D or 3D. It needs to perform well. It needs to have a high frame rate, and it needs to be fluid. That's the biggest criticism that games get these days on like DF Retro and stuff. Like, does it perform well, or does it constantly dip below 20 or whatever and kind of lag and stuff? Latency and performance are really the key factors these days. But back then it was like polygon count, you know, and bits. You know?
And it's so funny, hey? I mean, it's a 2D game, colorful. To Ben's point, would be received probably super well right now, and yet it remains locked to the Saturn. It is a Saturn exclusive. It hasn't been ported anywhere, hasn't been remade anywhere. If you want to play this game, you're going to need to play it on the Sega Saturn. So interesting. Okay, any final thoughts from any of us on Astal?
If this came out for Switch, I would buy it in a heartbeat. Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
No questions asked. I think that this would be a perfect Switch game. And if they gave it, like, you could control the difficulty and you could have achievements and unlock, you know, I think it would be amazing.
I feel like Limited Run Games just took note.
I hope so.
Yeah, if you're listening, Limited Run, this is a good one to port over. So,
I mean, I'm sure it's already on the radar, but would there be any licensing thing? I don't think so. Sega CS, right?
Yeah, it was done in-house, yeah, for sure. And so, you know, who knows? We've been getting all these SS Tribute games coming out on Switch, so, you know, who knows? It could potentially even happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it makes sense. And for the most part, I really enjoy it. I think a lot of people should try it if they haven't, because it's still a pretty fun platform, and I really enjoy it.
Wake up, dear friend. It's midnight. Welcome
Okay, let's move on to the next 2D platforming game, and it's actually a pair of games, although you could argue it is one whole complete game, and that is Clockwork Knight. So, the first Clockwork Knight game released right at the Saturn's launch here in North America, as well as in Europe. So, in 1995, it was met with some relatively lukewarm reviews. It certainly didn't get up to the same level of attention as the Daytona USAs or the Panzer Dragoons or even the Virtua Fighters of the launch lineup. So it was definitely sort of on the lower end tier of the launch lineups. And it was often actually compared to Toy Story, which came out a little bit later on the 16-bit platforms on the Super NES and the Genesis, and that was just an amazing game visually for the 16-bit systems. And so this game was sometimes compared unfavorably to that 16-bit game. And then not too long after, like less than a year later, we ended up getting Clockwork Knight 2, which is almost like the back end set of levels to the first game. Like they really flow from part 1 to part 2, right? And ultimately, eventually in Japan, the game was released on a single disc, like both games, part 1 and part 2. So clearly they were meant to be together. So some pretty solid 2D gameplay with some 3D visual elements. The colors, especially in the first game, can sometimes actually be a little jarring, but it's got some memorable music. Some people love it, some people can't stand it. So thoughts. I want to maybe start with you, Ben. Any thoughts on Clockwork Knight?
Yeah, so when I tried playing this game when it came out, it just it honestly was a little too slow on the pacing for me. It just felt, I don't want to say sluggish because it's not sluggish, but the movement speed of the character and the way he goes through the stages just because I was so used to faster paced platformers and ones that I felt like I had a little bit more control of. That was the one thing that kind of held against me on this game. But on the flip side, this game was beautiful, absolutely beautiful. Looked great, sounded great. It was very colorful and really just full of life.
Nice. Dave, your thoughts?
Well, I agree with Ben that this game is definitely full of life. It's colorful, it's vibrant. I would say that what it is so much to a degree that if it's something, it could be off-putting to some folks if it's just not your style or not your flavor. But again, Peter, I think you and I talked about this recently about expectation versus reality, what you expect versus what you get, and that sounds like a little bit of what Ben experienced. And I think that with Clockwork Knight, you really just have to embrace it for what it is. Embrace all the pastel colors, embrace the game mechanic, which is actually really sound, a really great platforming, some really cool like feedback that you get with the popping mechanic and the throwing and stuff like that. It does move slower. I would say that if it moved faster, you would die a lot more because there are a lot of like areas and hazards where you can easily lose sprockets or whatever. But yeah, no, I mean, it's very colorful. It's got this cute little story where Sir Tongar de Pepper Chow the Third, Pepper, he's a toy soldier. He's a clockwork soldier where he has to save Chelsea, who's like a princess or whatever. And the toy, I guess he's also got some competition who is a love interest as well, So anyway, it's just cute. It definitely at the time seemed derivative, but I don't think that's possible because it just happened to come out at the same time as the movie Toy Story, around that time. And then it seems like it was copying that, but it's not possible when you think about the fact that they had to be working on this for over a year, or close to a year, ahead of time. They wouldn't have known about Toy Story, maybe they would have known that it was coming, but they wouldn't have been able to copy Toy Story, So I imagine they probably got some inspiration from Pixar's Tin Toy, possibly.
Okay.
That is a possibility, but I definitely don't think. I think it was just a coincidence that they both happened to come out. It was a cool idea, and yes, people compared this to. I, for one, compared this to Toy Story the game because they both used digitized. What do you like pre-modeled digitized
3D,
sprite,
pre-rendered, 3D.
Exactly.
Yep.
Thanks, Pat. So pre-render 3D for the sprite, and then the backgrounds and all that stuff that was the thing that was unique to this game is that, a lot of the objects would fall into the foreground and you would be basically platforming on 3D objects, which was really cool. But I didn't appreciate that back in the day. I kind of judged this based on, the fact that I felt like it was derivative. But yeah, no, it's a really great game that has grown on me immensely over the years. And I used to hate the soundtrack. I used to think it was like really, really, I don't know, nails on a chalkboard. It's just so much, what it is.
Mhm.
It's just so much. It's extra, and it's got the banjo, which I mean, Super Mario World did the banjo, there were parts of it I thought were kind of derivative, but it's just, I don't know. It's grown on me. I'm not kind of lost for words. All I can say is that this game is, I think, very special. And as a pair of games, I think it's great.
Pat, how's your experience been playing the game?
So when I first saw it, I took it at face value, like, oh, it's one of those another, the dumb 3D games on Saturn that's like kind of meh. But when I really played it and I really looked into it, I really, really ended up enjoying it. I thought the controls are just so smooth in this game. It feels like he just does everything you want him to do, and I really like it. And like, I think one of the biggest distinctions, like Dave said about the Toy Story, is that it feels very Japanese. Like the music, like even. And that's what I like about it. They kept it very Japanese-esque. They didn't try to like Americanize it, like add sweet rock and roll guitars or mess up the soundtrack. It's blatantly Japanese, and I love it for it because like even though they recorded an English version of that opening, it was still like it was very Japanese J-pop feeling sound to the opening, which I
Yeah.
appreciate.
Yeah.
And like I think the game is very 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 nice. I love the 3D backgrounds and. I just really enjoy this game, and honestly, it grew on me, and I really think it's probably one of the hashtag best of Saturn games for real.
Nice.
Man, now you got me wanting to go back and play this again. I just kind of, when I first tried this, I was like, it's just not my flavor, and that's okay. You'll find games that just work for you or don't work for you. But now I kind of want to be like, I got to give Clockwork Knight another go.
I would definitely recommend that.
I was the same way. I had the same opinion, and it was listening to somebody, I don't even remember who, on a podcast talk so positively about it that made me think, maybe I don't get it, or maybe I wasn't giving it its fair due. Maybe I was just playing kind of like a quick sit down play and kind of jumping to conclusions about it. And then I went back and played it. And of course, I've loved it now for years, but I didn't always, But yeah, I think that it was Sega CS, Consumer Research and Development, that did Astal, and then it was Team Aquila that did Clockwork Knight.
So then they must have also done the sequel, then Clockwork Knight #2, obviously.
Yeah, which I don't ever think was really a sequel. I think it was
it
really like there was this idea to do this big long game, right? And they were just like, we need something now. Put a bookend on it and ship it. And then you guys can have more time to work on the second half. And then when you guys are all done, we'll put it together on a disc as a one thing, because it really does play seamlessly. It's not like it doesn't really have a proper ending. The first game doesn't have a
Right.
proper ending. So
Yes.
so I feel it was just always supposed to be just one big game,
Did they do the unreleased puzzle game, the unreleased Clockwork Knight
Clockwork
puzzle
Knight
game?
puzzle.
Yeah, did they
Let me
do that
check
as
real
well,
quick.
or
I
is it?
believe so.
It would make sense that it would have been them, right?
It would.
Some of these spin-offs though, sometimes they don't.
Penguin War, it doesn't really say from what we have. From the information that we have, it basically just says Sega, developer Sega. Maybe somebody else has more information, but that, of course, is a good thing to bring up because that, I feel like, is the forebearer of Choo Choo Rocket. A lot of the mechanics in Clockwork Knight puzzle would go on to be used heavily in like Choo Choo Rocket, with like the little
Interesting.
arrows and so I think that's kind of like there's a lot of DNA there, and folks should definitely try that out. It's available on Hidden Palace.
I'm gonna have to download it because I admit I have not yet tried Clockwork Knight puzzle. So
Seriously,
yeah, no, I know.
now I know what you're getting for Christmas.
Yeah, so I do have, but I'll just talk a little bit about my own experience with the Clockwork Knight games. So just like with Astal, I didn't really give it the time of day at the time because just like everybody else, I wanted the next big thing. I wanted the 3D games. I wanted something I'd never experienced before, et cetera, et cetera. And it could just also be because my tastes as a gamer back then were way more narrow. It's almost like saying, all you ever want is burgers, pizza, and fries. Whereas as you grow older and your palate develops, now you want some of the finer foods, right? It's kind of like that with me in gaming. So I've given the game a try again not too long ago, and I've played through the entire game, and I actually quite loved it. Initially the colors were too sort of overpowering for me. Like they were just too intense. And I didn't mind them this time around. Initially, the music I thought was like, okay, where in what back country did we get this music from? But,
Yeah,
right?
it's a genre mash.
Yeah, it really is. But again, it sort of grows on you. And then you sort of get into the second game, which I have to admit is a bit more polished visually. It just looks cleaner, better, smoother, maybe a little bit more like there's better color integration. It's not as offensive to the eyeballs, maybe, or not as strong on the eyeballs. So,
Because it starts out in the girl's bedroom, so it's all pink. Like that,
Right.
the first game starts out in the girl's bedroom, but each locale kind of changes. It's like a study where everything is wood grain and everything, So I think it's just very the fact that they decided to start out in like the girl's bedroom made it very like
Yeah, no, you're right.
striking to the eyes. It's blinding.
You know what this game actually reminds me of is Toy Commander a bit with the room traversing.
Yeah,
Mm.
that's not an unfair comparison. We're all grown men, and we all, I think, by now are, we like things like figurines and anime and cosplay and all these things that are kind of cutesy, Hatsune Miku, and it's just funny because, but back then though, you can't deny the fact that everything it was the grunge era. And everything was supposed to be really dark and edgy, You get bands like Tool and Nirvana and whatnot. It was just like it wasn't cool to like this kind of stuff in the West. We were still undergoing like a cultural eye-opening thing with a lot of Japanese culture coming over to the West, and it kind of would start on the coast, and work its way in.
Yeah, you would have people say that three-letter derogatory term for things if it wasn't,
Right.
hardcore, if it wasn't Spawn, like, oh, it's edgy. And that kind of was with the 90s. It was the decade of the edge, where it's like all those edgy, hardcore games. Even like the anime was incredibly hardcore. But like, if you had anything less of, decapitating and killing or something like that, or badass, it's like that's just that three-letter word that was derogatory about it. And it really is disappointing.
Yeah, teen gamers almost had like a phobia of stuff like this. You'd look at this and say, oh, either this is a little kid's game or it's girly or something like that. It's something that I don't feel comfortable liking because if I played this in front of my friends, I would get, teased at school. And that's kind of the thing. That's why I kind of kept Knights to myself, because I was just like, if I tell my friends that this is my favorite game, I will get laughed out of class, But yeah, and I've talked about this before with Peter. It's just, we were kind of afraid of like talking about emotion or talking about feelings and stuff like that. I don't want to go so far into it, but this, again, it's a cutesy game, and to just embrace this game and be comfortable with it for what it is, it means that you're just accepting the fact that it's kind of kidsy, it's kind of kiddie, and that's okay.
Definitely. I'm going to say one thing, though, that I found similar between the Clockwork Knight games and Astal, and that is an aspect of the control scheme. So by default, both Astal and Pepper are going to sort of move slowly, but if you double tap forward, they're going to go at a run, right? But I find the transition between the two is a little bit difficult sometimes, and it isn't like the walk is a bit too slow and the run is a bit too fast in both games.
Yes.
And so I love their control schemes in both games, and I find that the game controls well. There's no issues there, except for that one element, between the walking and the running.
And there's a latency.
Yeah, it feels like there is.
You're right. That is a criticism that I think we have to talk about. Yeah.
Yes. And Ben, I saw you nodding your head there, so you obviously agree with this too.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that latency between the walk and the run just made it really difficult to go into a run. And then once you're in the run, it just was, like you mentioned, really fast and just hard to deal with.
Yeah, I didn't notice it until you brought it up. It seems like there's a too fast of a run, too slow of a walk. There's never like any in between. Maybe that's how it was designed, though.
And there's no stop button. There's no like ground pound or way to kind of like immediately stop your character on a dime. Even with Knights, you can put both triggers and you can stop, like you do like an air brake kind of thing. Well, with platforming, you need to be able to stop on a dime sometimes, otherwise you end up careening off the edge. And that is a problem with this, with that slight latency between, you want to stop, but you're still running, so one of those things they didn't iron out.
Just curious from anybody, really, if anybody's got any sort of different thoughts or feelings about Clockwork Knight number 2, if that second part did anything, exceptionally different or better or what have you than the first game did?
It's harder. It's slightly harder difficulty wise, but that I think that's maybe a good thing because the first game is really short and it's pretty easy. It has better character models, and you get to ride a horse, which is like a broom horse or something. I don't know.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
so that's cool. There's like rail grinding and stuff.
Yep.
There's some neat ideas going on there.
Yeah, and just like I mentioned earlier, it seems like the visuals are a little bit more polished and tightened up. And there's a few extra effects thrown in. Like I think there's like some fog that you got to deal with in one of the rooms. I think it was the kitchen, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, the steam.
The steam, right? Yeah, or maybe it was the bathroom in that case. But yeah, there was that steam effect. So it looks a little bit sharper, I guess, maybe than the first game. But really, at the end of the day, the two games are essentially two halves of one whole.
Right.
And they are best played one after the other. And they didn't release too far off from each other, to be honest. The first one was a launch title. The second one came less than a year later. So definitely.
Clockwork Knight 2 it goes for a lot more. Long box, Western
Yeah.
long box, it goes for a lot more than Clockwork Knight 1. That would suggest that 1 is more common, I guess. Yeah, I have to assume that would suggest there was like a lower print run of number 2. Maybe 1 didn't like review particularly well, and so they just decided to not send over as many. Whereas like I think in Japan, it's negligible. Like it did much better in Japan, and I think they're kind of neck and neck in terms of value or whatever,
Yeah, and I would agree with that too.
Yeah.
And to be fair, if you want to play them, you don't have to necessarily get the US version unless you really want that
No.
music, because it's fully playable in English and in the Japanese version.
Absolutely.
If you just want the Japanese
For sure.
song, I think that's the really only difference to it. So
with arguably better box art.
yeah, okay, maybe the text, the text of the lady between, but that's about it.
Yeah,
it's very minimal.
It's a great series. That's another one I wish Sega would bring back.
Yeah, no, that's true. As a proper 2D with all the bells and whistles of what's possible today, I think it would be really good.
I mean, they own it outright, and there are
Yep.
no licensing issues that I can see. Like, why not? I mean,
Yep.
I just don't get it. It's so lovable. The characters are so lovable. I think people would really like it. But
Yeah.
Just like with Astal, this game is still exclusive to the Saturn as far as I know. I don't think it's come out anywhere else on anything modern, certainly nothing contemporary at the time, but even on modern, nothing's come out. Would you guys recommend that folks give this a try today?
100%, absolutely.
yes,
It's
absolutely.
really good.
I even need to give it a try today. So I would absolutely say if I've got to give it a try, and based on the feedback here, I think everybody listening should give it a try.
Yeah, honestly, even the price for the long box isn't even that bad in comparison to other games. Like, I think I'm seeing like the max is like maybe 100 for the Clockwork Knight 2, and maybe 40 to 50 or 40 to 60 for Clockwork Knight 1. So I think honestly, maybe the prices dropped on long boxes, but that doesn't seem bad to me anymore.
No, you're right. That's true. The first one was never one of the pricier games. The second one's a little higher, yes, but neither of them are, in the realms of insanity. So definitely affordable. All right, let's move on to our next game on the list. So when Pat is not grabbing Astal, he's probably reaching for some Gex, right?
Every day.
So
Every day.
All right.
All day I dream about Gexia. All day I dream about Gexia. All day I dream
Let's
about
talk
Gex.
about Gex, baby.
I love it. Love it. Okay, so Gex released mid-December 1995. It was originally a 3DO game. That's what Crystal Dynamics, that's where they wanted to have Gex. So it started on 3DO, but it was subsequently, like, they weren't satisfied with Gex just on the 3DO. They wanted to have Gex on the Saturn. They wanted to have Gex on the PlayStation. So there was a lot of Gex going on when the game came out.
Yeah, honestly, the thing with Gex though is that when you have it for the first time, it's not the best, and usually you have it in a really bad situation, so you have to move it to something. You have to do it somewhere better. You have to put Gex somewhere better. So I'm glad it moved to something a lot better than the first one, because the first one just wasn't, it wasn't there. It wasn't as good.
What are you talking about? Disagree.
I mean, I guess maybe you never forget your first time of playing some Gex. So
I just, I feel that we are really
When I
kind of.
get that feeling, I need actual healing. No.
Oh God.
I,
Okay, so
I think as you get older, just Gex gets better.
you know what? You're right. So, but innuendos aside, I think that I think that we need to just really be careful. So the gimmick in Gex is that he can scale walls and even sort of cling upside down to ceilings. So very thematic game, lots of different levels with different themes. And then the other memorable thing that this game did to quote unquote try to take advantage of being, on 32-bit platforms is there are a lot of voice acting clips that play throughout the game, like cheesy one-liners, very similar to what you would sometimes get in Bug, for example, right? So, and they're all, relatively kind of 90s funny the first time you hear them. Some folks will say that they can
They're
kind of
better. Dana Gould. I think they're better.
You think so, eh?
Oh yeah, I think Bug copied Gex, or I don't know, maybe that's not possible, but I think that the Gex's one-liners I always liked a little bit better than.
And like I know that back in the day when we talked to the president of Real Time Associates, like he said that the reason that Bug had a lot of the one-liners and whatever is that they were really aiming for this like Saturday morning cartoon, goofy
Right.
kind of, you know what I mean? Almost like a Looney Tunes kind of vibe, right? Whereas I think with Gex, it was more about getting like the comedy in, like the funny,
Yeah, adult,
right?
tongue-in-cheek, kind of over kids' heads, and it could be a kids and adult game, and definitely they did it more with Enter the Gecko. They, even more like, would
Yes.
Cheech and or Chong come to the reception desk, or they
Yes.
would put a lot of little things in, but Gex was a great game. Don't you think so? Like I think it's
yeah,
great. I love
I
it.
don't want to alarm you guys, but I think I'm having some issues. Gex isn't working for me right now. It's just locked up.
Oh,
I can't proceed with the
Okay.
Gex.
okay, so Gex was fantastic. This was absolutely on my radar when I was playing Saturn games when the Saturn was out. It was exactly what I wanted. It was a platformer. It had its unique little gimmick of the wall crawl and the tail whips, and I had so much fun with this thing. And it was actually a really good length of a game too. Like
Mhm.
you weren't going to finish it too quickly. It was long. I think like you could spend, granted, if you get the power ups or whatever, or the tokens or whatever it was, but what about 2 hours, 2.5 hours, something like that?
Yeah.
And and that's a great length of a game to play when you're a kid sitting in your living room.
And wasn't there an aspect to the game where you had to collect I could be wrong here, so correct me if I'm wrong, but you had to like be collecting parts of a remote or whatever, and if you found every single part in all the levels, you would unlock like an extra bonus additional level,
You
right?
collected remotes. You
Is that what it was?
collected
Okay.
individual
Okay.
remotes, but you also collected VHS tapes in the 3DO version, which you would put into the VHS and save your game. Where
Ah,
they got away with that, they went with a lazy password system in the Saturn version, which is one of the reasons to like the 3DO version better. The 3DO version, arguably, I can't say that it's the definitive version because there are some. Okay, only because with the Saturn you get the Saturn pad, and I would say
yeah.
that the game controls better with the Saturn pad, and it
Mhm.
does have some improved performance, frame rate and platforming performance. It's a little sluggish on 3DO, and you have to use the 3DO pad, which isn't the best pad. If I'm being completely honest.
Don't you argue that you think that the 3DO version is the better version?
The 3DO version definitely looks better. 3DO had a different color bit depth. It looks much more lush, and all of the graphics, all of the drawing, because a lot of like hand drawing went into it. You can see everything very clearly. When it was ported over to Saturn and PlayStation and perhaps other consoles, what happened was they had to change from one color bit depth to another, and it basically bloomed or basically crushed all the blacks and made everything like really white. So imagine just turning up the contrast really high. Well, what happens is like the graveyard scene in the backyard, in the background, just becomes black and like a silhouette. You can't see any of the artwork. The moon, the face on the moon, just becomes really washed out, and there's no detail. Whereas with the 3DO version, it's just everything just looks really colorful and vibrant, and there's detail there because of that difference in color bit depth. So with that and the VHS tapes for saving, I think that the 3DO has a good argument for it being the better version. But with the Saturn, you have a performance bump, and you also have the Saturn's pad, which is much better. I mean, it's the best 2D gaming pad that you can have. So it is kind of sad. You can't actually have the best version of Gex. You have to play either or and kind of deal with the compromises. But
Isn't that the way it works with Gex? But my thing is, I'm sorry, but yeah, why? I don't wonder. Has it ever been ported to a modern console? Like, is there any ways to have some modern Gex?
Like there's a good question. I mean, if Limited Run did that, like they recently ported D from the 3DO. If they did it, I think that they definitely should take the 3DO version, but to just make sure that it performs really, really well and has the original save functionality.
It's fitting, really, that they go from D to Gex. So I mean, there's some things there that could.
But
be
Ben's not wrong
implied.
about it was incredibly ubiquitous back in the day. Like Gex was everywhere. They had this interesting little box design where he's basically sitting there inside the game box, and it's like the cover is ripped off. And so like he's like kind of sitting there posing inside the game box. You know what I'm talking about?
Man, there's so many. I'm just gonna stop making jokes at this point.
Yeah,
They just
you
make
should.
themselves at this point. Oh my god!
But I mean, Gex was like Tomb Raider, essentially. It was, you walked into a store and you were just overloaded on every console.
Wasn't there actually like a Tomb Raider thing where like Gex was with Lara Croft at one point?
I don't know. Gex was Crystal Dynamics. It was really what put them on the map. And I know that there was some kind of connection between Crystal Dynamics and IDOS, right? Or wait, Core. I get confused.
You might be thinking of some of the magazines, because some of the magazines, when they were doing the artwork for like splash pages, they would very frequently use Gex and Lara Croft on the same splash.
Yeah.
Okay, I figured as
they were-
much.
yeah.
Yeah.
They were very popular.
I wonder if anybody did like the Duke Nukem thing. Where they had the. Never mind. I'm not gonna bring. Never mind.
And we all know what you're talking about.
Yeah,
Isn't
we
that
know what
sad?
you're talking about. Yeah.
We all know what you're talking about.
Yeah. No, I'm not gonna go there.
But okay, yeah, so Tomb Raider was IDOS, but eventually Crystal Dynamics picked up the rights to Tomb Raider, so that could be some of the connection.
Tomb Raider was Core though, right? Early?
So Core developed it and IDOS
developed-
published it, right?
IDOS published it, and IDOS basically would go on. Core would kind of disappear, right? And it would just be IDOS in the modern Tomb Raiders, right? And
Yeah.
then what was the connection between Crystal Dynamics?
Well, Crystal Dynamics ultimately ended up, I don't know if they bought the Tomb Raider franchise and they put out a bunch of Tomb Raider games, or if they just published them or whatever, but there was definitely that connection. So that could be where some of the Gex, Lara Croft, but like, like Ben was saying, like, I remember that too, various sort of splash sort of ads and spreads in magazines. They often had those two characters on there because you're right. Isn't it weird? Like, Astal wasn't everywhere, Clockwork Knight wasn't everywhere, but Gex was everywhere,
Crystal Dynamics knew how to market a game. They would put trailer reels on their disc. So I don't know if this goes for Saturn, I haven't looked at it recently, but on every Crystal Dynamics game on the 3DO, you pop the game in and it immediately plays a trailer reel of all of their games, like, check out this new game, blockbuster title, and you'd have to, like, when you press A, then it would go to the title screen, but you could always go back and play that trailer reel if you wanted to. I mean, they were just so heavy on marketing, their games. And I mean, the same would go for something like, Pandemonium, which was Crystal Dynamics.
Yep.
Yeah, they marketed and pushed that game so much. I mean, it made it to Engage, for goodness sake, but it was like everybody knew about that game because you'd go into your game store and you'd have standees and you're just marketing up the wazoo with that, and you'd have nothing for Astal. You wouldn't hear about Astal, It was crazy.
So I'll say though that the one, this is a criticism that you can level against a lot of 2D platform games on the Saturn, and it's the lack of the password or sorry, the lack of the save. Like you
Mhm.
had passwords or you had nothing, but you didn't have, an end game save system that took advantage of, internal memory. And I don't understand why not. Like,
I mean, the
why
game's
wouldn't you?
code had it. It had it. It has it on the 3DO. It's amazing. I love it. You can save your game. All you have to do is in any level, you find the VHS tape, and that's the one caveat. You can't just save de facto. You have to find the VHS tape, and if you do, so it's almost a reward. You get to pop it into the VHS player and hit record, and you can save your game.
Mhm.
And then when you boot up the game, you're greeted with a little VHS player, and you can press play, and it boots up your save. I don't know why they didn't bring that over to Saturn. It's so lazy to just do a password.
Yep. Oh yeah, for sure.
I
Anyway,
know it seems like a lot of people were just like, you know what, let's not. We don't have time to implement this password system. Let's just implement this save system. Let's just add a password like with Command and Conquer.
Could it
With
be?
like,
Could it be that they weren't smart enough? Some of these third parties weren't smart enough to figure out how to get save files small enough. Like they could figure out the save, but it would take over the Saturn's entire internal memory. Because they weren't smart enough to figure out the compression. So they were just like, forget about it. We'll just do a password. We've interviewed a few folks that have mentioned that it was like it wasn't enough to just implement saves. You had to know how to like compress it to make it so that it wouldn't take up so much data on Saturn's internal memory.
Fascinating. And that could, because if you think about it, I mean, Sonic 3D Blast, no save. Clockwork Knight, no save. Gex, password only. It's a very pervasive issue, and it didn't need to be, in my opinion. It was just because at the end of the day, who's going to have time to sit down and commit 2.5, 3.5, 4 hours to go through a game? I mean, the older we get, the less likely it is that we will have that kind of time commitment that we can put on it, right?
Mhm.
So it's a missed opportunity for me.
One thing we didn't talk about is the overworld. So like
Mm,
Mario Brothers 3 and Mario World would do it first. Like big overworld, different lands with different themes and stuff. But Gex was really cool with that. You had the TV. It was basically like the TV world, and each zone consisted of like 6 to 8 levels or something, where you'd hop into these TV tubes.
yep.
Glowing TV tubes, and you'd go into a level. But like, so the first level that you're greeted with is the graveyard level, which is wonderful because you got the music and you've got the vibe and the ambiance of Halloween, basically. And so it's one that I recommend folks go to every Halloween because it's just dripping with that kind of, Saturday morning cartoon Halloweeny kind of
Mm,
experience. And then when you get through that, you go to like the cartoon land of cartoons, and everything is really wonky and cartoon like. And then after
definitely.
that, what does it go after the cartoons? Was it space or something? I forget. I haven't played that far in so long. But I
Yeah.
finish quickly these days. No, I'm just kidding.
Oh God. I blame
but uh,
you, Pat. 100%.
good.
yeah, no, it's great. I love the overworlds, and I just love it when games go out of their way to create a unique sense of flavor. Gex doesn't feel like a budget title. It feels like they put time and work into it. Whether or not it's for you, that's up to you to decide. But it's a crafted game. It's a well crafted game. The people that made it, they cared. And
Yep.
I guess the only thing I would ask you, Peter, or Ben, or Pat, how do you guys feel about Gex 2D Gex versus 3D Gex, which it became like on the N64 and PlayStation, Enter the Gecko?
I kind of prefer Gex in 2D. And 3D, I think, kind of went a little bit over the top.
Like just a
Maybe it
collectathon,
was,
right?
yeah, it kind of like it became like oh, it's funny talking animal parody game, sort of like Conquer, except not as good.
Mm-hmm.
Ah,
It was
good
almost like
point.
it kind of felt like Spyro, but not nearly as good because like Spyro
Yeah.
really did that genre well. And when Gex made it to 3D, not so much, which is why it didn't really last, as a genre.
Yeah, basically, yeah, the 3D version of Gex, it just didn't have that kind of pop, that thing that just comes with the game to
Mm,
get you sucked into it. And the 2D version, absolutely, yes, love that version.
Yeah.
3D, yeah, it just felt kind of like a forced gimmick, like they would have pushed on like the Nintendo 64 or something.
Right.
yeah, I would agree. Anytime that you can play a platformer both in 2D and 3D, I almost invariably prefer the 2D, whether that's Mario or Sonic or Gex, right? I tend to veer more towards 2D.
Yeah. Well, I think that folks are kind of coming around to Gex, and there's been YouTubers that get behind this game and are like, this series needs more love. But definitely, if folks have an opportunity to play it on 3DO and kind of see the difference, I definitely think they should. Not everybody has a 3DO though, so I mean, if you can play it on
honestly though, like Gex just gets better with age, like Ben was saying.
Okay.
Oh God. Ben, would you recommend Gex?
Absolutely. Yeah. If you're a platforming fan, or let's just simplify that, if you like Mario games, you're going to love Gex. Gex is amazing. It's fantastic.
Nice. Anyone not recommend Gex?
Who wouldn't? Who doesn't like Gex?
Well, that's true. That's a good point. It's always good to have some Gex. Let's talk about the next game on our list, which is Rayman. Came out on the Jaguar and the PlayStation, and then just like a few months later on the Saturn. The versions, they all came out really basically in the fall-winter of 1995, and really that's a common theme with a lot of the games that we're discussing today. They're all 1995 games, so that's not to say that platformers suddenly stopped existing, in that generation after 1995. But I almost feel like that was the one big genre during the 16-bit generation. And so it almost felt like that's the one genre that folks should have been most comfortable with, in 32-bit land, right? But then, of course, all the new stuff came out, all the 3D experiences came out, and so that's probably a big reason why 2D really faded out of the limelight quickly. But yeah, so Rayman, another late 1995 release. It's a very long game. It's even got some light Metroidvania type elements, because as the game goes on, Rayman picks up new abilities that allow him to sort of reach previously inaccessible areas and what have you. And there's definitely a collection aspect to the game. And so to be able to collect everything 100%, you're going to have to go back to levels you've played previously with newly acquired powers and moves to be able to collect absolutely everything. The game is known for its exceptional 2D graphics, as well as its really catchy and pretty smart score by Rémi Gazelle. He's a French gentleman. The entire project was directed by Michel Ancel, who is also known for things like Beyond Good and Evil and a bunch of other games. The game actually reviewed really well across the board. All versions scored really highly. And if there's any criticism that can be pointed at the game, it would simply be that the game, a lot of folks report that this is a difficult game. It is a really tough platformer. I'm not sure that I personally agree with that, but I just want to maybe get the conversation started.
I mean, I think it's difficult. I think that subsequent Rayman games, at least the 2D ones like Legends? Or I forget, Origins?
Yeah, that's the PC Origins. Yeah, that's the one on the 2012.
They kind of
right?
toned down the difficulty. Made it easier for gamers of all skill levels to kind of get in. But yeah, with the original one, it was pretty. There were definitely parts of it that you'd have to keep going back and doing over. But I mean, really, this was the game that put Ubisoft on the map, just like Gex was the game that put Crystal Dynamics on the map. This was like, and they've continued to refine it. And then even when it made its way to 3D, they did an amazing job with it. And then they brought it back to 2D, and it's always been good. Like, I don't know of a bad Rayman game. It's just like an acquired taste. Like, you either really love Rayman or...
I know a bad Rayman game.
Which one is that?
Raven Rabbits.
Oh, but yeah, see, the Rabbids is like, that's like another thing. I don't really, I mean, I guess that is Rayman, and of course the Rabbids came out of Rayman, But yeah, that's a whole other topic.
It is sad though how much it deviates to the point where, oh yeah, they have a whole game with Mario in it, and it's like, oh, I guess Rayman is like, he's put to the sideline. He's a sideline in his own series,
Have any of you
kind of sad?
Have any of you had the opportunity to play the Jaguar version at any point? Ben has. How would
Yes.
you? So this is interesting. So because a lot of people will say, one version is definitive or one version is better. I know the Jaguar version is a little more trimmed down. It's just it's the original, right? So there are some small differences. But how would you say it is from a difficulty aspect versus like the PlayStation or Saturn?
So the Jaguar version, when I was playing it, I remember that it was a really smooth playing game. That it was very well done for the system. The hardest part with the Jaguar version was the controller that you were using to play with. So you had to get used to that while you were playing it. Now the length of the game was pretty long, obviously, and there were difficult sections. But the difficulty in when you were playing the Jaguar version, you die, you try again, you die, you try again. It's kind of almost like a Cuphead scenario where you're expected to die, and then you just keep playing it over and over until you figure out the pattern and what you need to do. Jump on this character, do that, helicopter fist, whatever it was. And so as far as that goes, like the Jaguar version was really polished. Like I really liked it, to be honest.
So how would you compare it to the Saturn version? Have you played much of the Saturn version?
Yeah, so I did the Saturn, and I'm trying to remember the differences between the two. I feel like the color palettes were definitely different. They were both colorful games, but they just kind of it just had a little bit of a different feel to it, I guess you could say. And then I'm trying to remember if the movement was different. I just cannot remember though.
Okay, Peter.
Well, I was just gonna. So I have not played the Jaguar version, but I have sort of read a lot of articles comparing all the versions, and the biggest difference that's a strike against the Jaguar version is being a cartridge-based game. The sound is not CD quality like it is on all the other versions, right? But other than that, like folks were quite praiseworthy of all the ports. Like they were all really close to each other.
Was there not a Jag CD version?
I don't believe so. No, I think it's just cartridge only. So
I know a version that probably none of you played, though.
which one is that?
Have you played the Super Nintendo version?
So funny you should mention that, because Rayman initially started development for the Super NES.
That's right.
Before it was scrapped, and then it moved on to Jaguar. So was that eventually leaked? Like, is there a proto out there?
Yeah, you can download now.
Was it just supposed to be the vanilla SNES, or was it supposed to be the Nintendo PlayStation? Like
it was supposed to be. It's supposed to be the regular the SNES.
okay.
But the thing is that it's really a rough demo. I think it's like less than a stage, and you just move back and forth. I think it's just as much as they got before they started porting it.
Subsequently, it's been ported to a lot of different systems. Subsequently, handheld. I think wasn't there a DS version?
There was a Game Boy Advance version, and then eventually a Nintendo DS version too. Yeah. And
which were all pretty good.
You want me to get a little technical on you on the Jaguar? Somebody asked if there was a Jaguar CD version. Okay, so the Jaguar, was cartridge based, and so of course cartridge based the read access is a lot faster than the CD based, at least back in the day. Okay, right? So the Jaguar CD comes out. The Jaguar CD, I took it apart and looked at how it was built. The Jaguar CD was basically more allocation for memory as far as space for the game, so you get a lot of prettier graphics, audio, stuff like that. But you're still having the old antique versions of read access for a CD drive, so it's slower than the cartridge based, but you have more memory of space to store the information.
Probably wouldn't have benefited in any way.
Yeah, the only way I can see it benefiting is getting an audio boost, because you'd be able to do the more high fidelity stuff because you have more memory to be able to allocate specifically for that. But beyond that, you probably would have to wait for it to load into the buffer cache memory for each stage, which would have taken longer than doing it through the cartridge.
Yeah, that was that weird time where you had like cartridge and CD pairings, like the Jag with the then the 32X CD, where you'd have to use like the cartridge and the Sega CD at the same time.
Well, only the rich kids would have that. They play like what, one game for it, 2 games,
right? It was just a very strange time in gaming history.
Yes, this was the time where folks were able to release anything and everything, even though they knew like 6 people would buy it. It would still get greenlit, right?
Right.
So yeah, it was, definitely. So, I've played Rayman on the PlayStation, and I've played Rayman on the Saturn. The Jaguar version I've not played. And I have played the way later subsequent handheld versions of the first Rayman. I'll agree with you, Dave, that the entire franchise, not counting the sort of offshoot Rabbids stuff, is really great, with one exception. I was not a fan of Rayman 3 Hoodlum Havoc.
Oh, right. Hoodlum Havoc.
I did not like that at all. And so interestingly, Michel Ancel directed the first Rayman, as well as Rayman 2 The Great Escape, which is one of my favorite Dreamcast games.
Amazing
it is
game.
so good.
Yeah.
And it was that to me was a beautiful way of taking an excellent 2D game and transitioning it into 3D.
It's great on the N64 too.
It
Just,
is,
you
yeah,
know,
you're
yeah.
absolutely right. And it
For what it
uses
is, you know?
the N64's expansion cartridge, and it's a really beautiful game on N64 as well. So yeah, but back to the and Michel Ancel was not involved in Rayman 3 Hoodlum Havoc, and I think the game really kind of suffered as a result. But in terms of the original Rayman as a platforming game on the Saturn, I absolutely love it. To me, it's got the perfect difficulty level, because it is never, like, you're right, Dave. You die a lot, you fail quite often, but you never get the sense that is because of broken controls or like unfair deaths or anything like that.
Right.
At the end of the day that you've got to have a really high precise skill attuned to Rayman to be able to do well in the game. And to me, it and this was reinforced in, I think, the later 2D Rayman outings, such as Origin or Legends. There's almost like a parkour aspect to the game, where you're doing these like very precise, crazy leaps and jumps and ducks and tumbles, where one wrong move and you're kind of toast. And I actually sort of enjoy that, because again, the control is very tight. It controls super well, and you're able to pull off some satisfying maneuvers.
I think that it is like you say, the I guess learning curve. What the game does is it keeps throwing new mechanics at you.
Yeah.
Like the platforming mechanic is always consistent, what you're able to do, but you do get new powers, right? And it always throws new things at you very quickly. You're like going along and you think you have everything figured out, and now the water's rising and you have this new thing that you need to do, jumping from platforms and trying to stay alive that way. And so the environmental aspect of it is constantly changing and requiring you to do new things, like in the music level, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the thing where I feel like it's constantly changing up to keep the game fresh, but it's also creating this constant challenge, which means you do, like Ben said, you die a lot and you just kind of have to start over. So from that aspect, I think that it's harder, because games like, simpler platforms like Super Mario Brothers are pretty straightforward. Like, it doesn't change that much, yeah, there's a water level, but for the most part, it's this game changes up a lot. And arguably that's a good thing, because it keeps the gameplay fresh throughout the entire game.
Do you know why he has no limbs?
Oh, do tell.
So the developers originally intended for Rayman to have limbs, but they found out when they were working the game onto the consoles that it wouldn't run correctly with the limbs attached. So they tried a development move by just removing the limbs while they were doing some prototyping. And by removing the limbs, it fixed the problem. So they just decided to, it's good without limbs.
Interesting. Yeah, because that's definitely one of his memorable sort of characteristics. Any thoughts on the music? Because I love it. It's fully orchestrated, at least on the Saturn version anyways. And to me, it's super memorable. Like, some of those tunes are super sort of, mood setting, thematic. I think they're great.
Yeah, music's great. Once I start hearing some Rayman tunes, I recognize it immediately.
Yeah, It's all stellar stuff, like it's all very well done. Yeah, it's just that I don't consider any of the tunes to be incredibly memorable, where I would be like humming them in my head. But it is definitely kind of like a vibe, and it's great orchestral music that sets the tone for the levels.
And again, between the super brilliant, vibrant visuals and the orchestral CD soundtrack, you really do get a sense with this game that, yes, it's a 2D platformer, but it is definitely something that would not have been, possible to this degree on the old, Mega Drive Genesis or the Super NES. So, I think this is it's a really good game. And I have to admit, I love the Metroidvania type aspects to it. I love getting new powers, because to your point, Dave, throughout the game, first you get the ability to throw your fist, then you get a running ability, then you get the ability to hang on these like purple rings, and you can kind of swing on them and whatever. So you end up going back because there is an overworld, so you end up trekking back to some of the levels that you haven't explored fully because you couldn't, and you end up collecting everything up to 100% throughout the game, which
Right.
it kind of it yes, it makes the game a little bit longer, but it's done in a really good solid way. Like, it's very enjoyable. And for all those, and I do see this a lot on YouTube Let's Plays and other places where folks say this game is brutally hard. I mean, it is difficult, but it's not difficult in an unfair way or in any cheap or cheesy sort of way. So if this is a gamer's game almost, right, where you have to kind of dedicate a little bit of time and you have to really focus on what you're doing and really be sort of into it to progress, especially in the later levels. But do you think the learning curve is fair? Because those first few levels are pretty easy, and then it just does kind of ramp up.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's unfair. I just think that you asked, is it hard? Yeah, well, it's not easy, and of
Yeah.
course it's old school, and
Yeah.
games arguably have gotten easier, either for better or worse. I don't know. But when we were kids, we had plenty of time to throw at this stuff. These days, as 40-year-olds trying to do a quick Let's Play for, content, okay, it's like, okay, wow, this game is a lot harder than I remember, and I can't get very far. It's, that's my problem because when I was 15 and I would get home from school, I'd have, several hours to throw at this stuff, and kind of like the first Panzer Dragoon, that was incredibly hard as well, and it's like, if you wanted to see it to the end, you died a lot,
You had to
but you remember
persevere through that,
you
right?
had to persevere, you had to memorize the course and figure out what the most efficient way to dispatch everything was, to hang on to your life. But yeah, that again, that's how old school games were, so I can't fault
Mhm.
it for that. So here's kind of a stupid question, but do you feel like this game is kind of like really French? Like it has, in terms of its vibe, in terms of its artistic aesthetic and its overall vibe, it is quite literally a French game, right? Ubisoft developer is French, and it just has, okay, like there's Japanese games, right? And there's Western games, American
Mhm.
developed games, and then there's like an Ubisoft game, especially like Rayman, just has a very specific aesthetic and feel to it that to me is just like, it's a very French game. There's this other series, what is it? Asterisk and Oblit.
Yes. Yep. Yep.
There are a few of them, where you're just like, this feels like a French game, and that's not a bad thing. That's not that's in no way a dig at it. It's just that's what Rayman has always felt to me, was that it was, and I can't put a finger on what it is, other than the fact that I know it's developed by a French company, but it has a flavor to it that's unlike really any other 2D platformer, you know?
So I've never thought of it quite the way you described it, but I totally get where you're coming from. To me, what makes it French or even European for that matter, or gives it that vibe is, first of all, it is rich and refined while at the same time trying to be lighthearted.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not going to really ever find anything broken with the game.
Right.
Everything that you see and hear is going to be exquisite, or it'll aspire to that, and
Right.
yet dancing on that refined and exquisite stage is a character who is lighthearted and full of joy and fun and all that kind of stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
from that perspective, yeah, that makes sense. I'd never thought of it that way, but I get it.
Maybe it's the surrealism, I guess, because French are really big into surrealism.
Hmm. Hmm.
I hope I'm not trying to stereotype. I'm just saying, like, a lot of French art and stuff like that has dabbled with surrealism, and also like Knights was inspired by Mystere, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
The Cirque du Soleil, which is also a French thing. It's a French traveling circus, and
Hmm.
was really this French flair of performance and art and style, I think, is apparent in the Rayman series in a way that It is not in Gex, for example. Gex to me
Sure.
feels like a very Western take on platforming, you know? And
Mm-hmm.
then Mario to me feels like a very Japanese take on platforming, you know? And Rayman, it's just very clear that this is a very French take on 2D platforming and art and surrealism and just the visual aesthetic and the music and everything to me. And so that is a good thing. I think it adds to the uniqueness of this series and why it endures, you know, is because it is enough of a unique flavor.
That makes sense. And it's interesting. I find, just in general, as a general comment, maybe, I find that the Saturn was a bit of a breeding ground for so many different ideas, cultures, flavors. It was definitely not homogeneous like we tend to think of gaming experiences now. And so you could really get you could go from Gex to Rayman to something like Corpse Killer to a rally racing game. Like, you just kind of, had it all, and each of those experiences really had almost like a distinct personality to them, more so maybe than I think we get nowadays.
That triumvirate, though, that Astal, Gex, and Rayman, all different, you know, unique at the same time. You know, they all have beautiful 2D hand drawn graphics, and yet they all have like a slightly different style to them because of the cultural background that they come from. I think.
Mm-hmm.
Not trying to go too deep, but it is something that just occurred to me.
Yeah. No, it's very fair. Okay, I want to just do a quick roundtable, final thoughts, and whether you recommend Rayman or not, and maybe we'll start at the top of the house with Ben.
Yeah, so there is a reason that Rayman has a lot of sequels and is still being published on newer consoles to this day. It is a very fair game. It is a very challenging game. It's got a good link to it, and you get everything from power ups to just a pretty game all the way around. I think it's proven that it is a very respectable game to give a try to if you haven't yet.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Pat?
I think it's a pretty good game. Like I said, if you haven't played it like me, you might not, it might be a bit difficult at first, but I think it's really enjoyable. I recommend definitely trying it if you haven't tried it before.
All right, and then you, Dave?
Yeah, I think that I understand where Pat's coming from. I don't think that it's for everyone. I know other people who don't necessarily like Rayman, but me personally, I think that it's very well made. So much so that it was able to shine through the prejudice against 2D games at the time. You know, it was able to
Mm-hmm.
get some good feedback and critical acclaim and endure despite that. Yeah, I feel like it's very well made. Arguably, perhaps better, even more well made than Gex or Astal. You know, and that's saying something. I think that it is fair. It is kind of hard uh, from a skill level, you know, and just having to endure with it if you're going back to it these days, but never unfair. So yeah, I definitely think folks should absolutely check it out. And it's a game that it kind of commands a high price, I think, too. If you're going for like a US long box of it. I don't know if that suggests that there weren't that many made or what, but yeah, I mean, it's definitely one of those games that's like what is it, like $100 game or something? I don't know if it's reached
That's
that.
definitely on the higher end for sure. For sure.
Yeah.
So, and just a couple of fun facts from me. It is, to my knowledge, the only third-party game in the US library which had a demo disc put out for it. There were a million demo discs in
Right.
Japan. There were quite a lot in Europe as well, but there weren't very many in North America. And I believe that Rayman, the demo, is the only demo put out by a third party in North America. So
Third
that's
party.
fun.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
right. Okay, and so that's fun fact number one. Fun fact number two is, on the PlayStation in the United Kingdom, Rayman is the best selling PS1 game of all time, which blew me
Wow.
away when I learned that. Like, bigger than Tomb Raider 2, Gran Turismo, you name it. In the United Kingdom, the best-selling PS1 game of all time is Rayman, which was stunning and shocking. I had no idea, So, but here we are. It is, at the end of the day, I think, a really solid game, and definitely a Saturn experience that folks should dedicate some time to. I think you're in for a good treat.
I would have thought it would have been a soccer game or something like that.
No
But
kidding,
no.
hey?
Yeah, isn't that crazy? Okay, cool.
Just wild, 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 wild. Okay. So typically, when we have a thematic podcast like this, we like to dive into maybe an obscure entry from the theme that we're working on. And today we're going to talk a little bit about a 2D platforming game called Tryrush Deppy. It's a Japan-only release. It came out in November of 1996, and the premise of the game is you're like an animated taxi, your little animated car, and you're in a race across the United States. Now, there is no actual race per se. You're not racing in game against other, taxi cabs, but your goal is to make it from the beginning of the level all the way to the end of the level as quickly as possible. And the gimmick here is that you have like a gas meter that is continuously depleting. So it's continuously going down. If it goes down to 0, you run out of gas and you essentially die. You've got like a dash mechanic that you can use, and it's really handy when fighting against bosses. And to sort of, keep your gas levels up, you can find cans of gas throughout the levels, and then that'll sort of replenish you a little bit, and then you can get going. If anything, this game is actually known for being one of the more expensive original Saturn games that you can get. If you want to get a copy, it's going to cost you several hundreds of dollars. And I'm not sure if that's because, it wasn't printed in the highest qualities, or if maybe Western gamers have really kind of taken a liking to it and it's a supply-demand issue. I'm not entirely sure, but yeah, Tryrush Deppy. Any of you guys have given this game a shot here?
Oh yeah.
I actually really like it. I just think it's weird, though. It's a weird game, just because it's like you'd expect it to be some sort of racing game, but
it's not, right?
It's a platform. It's like okay, it's unique. I like it in that aspect. You think, oh, Tryrush Deppy, and it's like, no, it's a platforming game, and I'm shocked how expensive it is, though. Like, it's not a cheap game, right?
Mm-mm.
So does anybody remember the name of the taxi cab and Who Framed Roger Rabbit? This is what this game reminds me of. It's like, this is the toon version of the taxi cab and Roger Rabbit going around, and this is his thing.
I always got the name mixed up with Dynamite Heady. Tryrush Deppy,
sure.
Dynamite Heady. But I mean, that was a treasure game. And this is Nihon Create?
Yeah.
I think it's cute. I think it's really funny that he's a car and yet he walks on his rear tires instead of like driving like a car. But I mean, that's great. It's so funny. It's like, it's kind of off the wall. So it's this cute little taxi cab sprite, just kind of tiptoeing on his rear wheels. and then he does these dash moves that you say, like, it is not the best platforming game, but it's certainly not bad at all. Like, it's in the conversation with like stuff like Gex and stuff. It's a good, to me, it's like a good B plus. It doesn't reach perfection, but it's a good fun game.
It's definitely unique.
It is unique. Yeah.
You're not going to find too many 2D platformers based on a taxi cab or whatever. And the visuals are really kind of nice. The foreground is nice and crisp. The backgrounds are sort of more muted and pastel-like. Like, it just visually, right. It works really well. And I get it. In today's day and age, there are ways of finding, ROMs and images and whatever to play the game. But an original disc is insanely expensive. Kind of like another 2D platformer that is extremely expensive. I'm talking about Super Tempo. Oh, yeah. Very, very expensive game. Another 2D platformer. But yeah, it's definitely unique. It's, not something that you would ever think to try, especially not from the title. And you're right, it does kind of sound almost like a treasure game, Tryrush Deppy. It just, I don't know, it's got that bit of a vibe, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's funny how they try to, sexualize his taxi cab love interest, or I don't know. He hasn't. There's like a car, and it's a girl. It's always funny when they try to do that. It's got a very pastel kind of.
You say it'd be like Gex and Cars?
I mean, it's got a very pastel color palette in the first opening level, which is like the city cityscape. It's pretty colorful and vibrant. I'm looking at what Pat's playing, and now it's turned kind of dark and has almost like a Batman and Robin kind of color palette thing going on. I don't. It's an interesting game. I can't say much about it because it doesn't stand out among like a lot of the other big ones. But and again, the price to acquire this might be part of the fact that a lot of folks haven't played.
Yeah.
it.
And
But I mean,
honestly, I don't think it's worth it for the price, like $350 for this. I'm not
just
don't recommend.
rarity, right?
It's expensive.
Easily though, fire it up on an ODE and play it, and I think that it's a fun little experience. What do you think, Peter? I mean, how much time have you spent with this game?
I haven't finished it, but I've got several levels in, and it's a game that you're balancing between going as fast as you can and finding everything in the level, and of course locating the cans of extra gas, because the worst is when you're fighting a boss and all of a sudden you run out of gas, especially if you're really close to having defeated that boss, right? So the gimmick is interesting. It can sometimes be a little bit frustrating, but I think overall it's a cool little game. I wish more stuff like this had officially come out in the West instead of it being locked away in Japan and folks being forced to import. So, definitely a worthwhile game. Is it as good as, for example, Rayman or Gex? To your, just like with you, I think it's in the conversation. I don't think I'd put it higher than any of those games, but it's good. It's fun. I'd recommend folks give it a try for sure. Any last thoughts on Tryrush? Oh my God.
Tryrush.
Tryrush.
I mean, I think you have too much. You have too much Gex on your mind.
Oh God.
Going through a little dry rush spell.
The artwork is great. The in the manual, on the cover, the hand drawing, and then the sprite work and everything like that. The artwork is definitely great, and I think that that's what it has going for it in spades. Game mechanic, the gas tanks, cool little clever, replacement for like a life bar that can be replenished. So it's got a cute, clever little gameplay mechanic, pretty standard, fair platforming, and then really good artwork. So yet the price, only the most dedicated are going to pick up a copy physically. But I mean, burn yourself a copy or try it on a ODE. I would definitely recommend it.
Ben, any last thoughts?
It definitely seems inspired by like the Sonic the Hedgehog series with the dashes and like the stars at the end of the levels and stuff
Fair.
like that. And so I can see where it gets a lot of its inspiration from, and then it adds in some of the quirkiness, like having the walking around taxi cab. That kind of reminds me of Ninja Baseball Batman, if you guys know that one.
Yeah.
That's pretty
Yeah.
good.
And so yeah, it's quirky, but I don't think it's worth the price. I don't even know if I'd recommend people picking up the original copy unless they're just going for a complete Japanese set.
Okay, and so that brings us towards the end of our cast. I think it was a good one. It was a good conversation. And I just, I want to say that there were really many other 2D platformers on the Saturn, including games like Sonic Jam, obviously, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, another big one, Kyo Flying Squadron 2, Psychic Assassin Teramaru, the Mega Man games, Earthworm Jim 2, Johnny Bazooka Tone. There were really quite a lot. There were also several bad examples, such as Mr. Bones. I did not write that line. How did that line get in there, Pat?
I don't know. Are you sure you didn't write that? I don't remember. I think I saw that earlier, so maybe you wrote that in. I don't know.
Yeah, I must have been in a daze. Wow, brilliant. Well done. Well played.
Yeah.
Well played.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, like I said, technically it's a 2D platformer and you left it out, so I just wanted to...
Thank you, Pat. Thank you so much.
I actually would love to do a Castlevania cast one of these days, just talk about Symphony of the Night, because I don't think we've ever really talked about it on the cast per se, like a full talk through, except for like a Halloween list.
A full Castlevania?
Oh, that's good, Dave. That is
It
good.
just
I like
sells
that.
itself.
Oh.
I like it. A pod Castlevania. I'm done. I'm down.
Let's take a game like Gex or Rayman, which were as popular as you can get for the genre that they were, despite being, an unpopular genre at the time, and compare those with the first Tomb Raider, which I know Peter is a huge fan of, right? But arguably the first Tomb Raider on Saturn controls like absolute garbage compared to these games, which are like refined to, you know, Chef's Kiss. Like these 2D platforming experiences represent like the pinnacle of where the genre had gone. And yet all everybody wanted was stuff like Tomb Raider, you know, where you're literally having to like inch a little bit to the left. Oh no, wait, go, let's inch a little bit to the right. Okay, we gotta, oh, we fell off. Let's get back on. Okay, let's inch a little bit to the ledge and let's try to make this jump. Oops, we fell. Let's go back. And that's what people wanted because it was 3D, you know.
I think it's weird. It's like everyone's like I just hate how freaking Tomb Raider and the ratings was better than Gex essentially to people.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm not saying it was bad. Like Tomb Raider was the birth of a new genre, right? And it represented a huge technical leap, right? And I'm not saying it's not deserving of the praise that it got, but I think that it's just funny when you compare and contrast these two. You know, you have like a genre that's been so refined to the point of working, you know, getting most of the kinks worked out and just being a really, really good experience versus, you know, what was actually popular at the time, which was a genre that was just very, very much still trying to find its own feet, you know?
Yeah, I just think it's crazy that people like look at that reviewers like, oh yeah, Tomb Raider is way better than Gex, and it's like you play both now, and it's like, wow, I don't know what were they smoking? I mean,
3D
damn,
boobs. You know, I mean,
I guess I don't know whether it's 3D boobs and Gex. I don't know. I don't know which one I would have went with, to be honest. Probably the Gex. I don't know.
Well, that's why you had Gex and Lara Croft in the same shot, right?
God.
Yeah, exactly. You can't have one without the other.
But to sort of echo a little bit what you were saying earlier, Dave, I have this like advertising pamphlet that Sega put out for Christmas '95, and it was like this little buffet setup where there's this chef and there's this long like all-you-can-eat buffet table, and each section is for each console that they supported at the time with a bunch of games in there. So this was the time where there was Saturn and Genesis and 32X, everything, right? And, you know, a good deal of those games, I'd say probably about half of them are 2D games. Like I'm talking about games like Colibri for 32X or whatever. So good, or Vector Man for Genesis. So clearly 2D platforming games. And yet every single description for every single game mentions that they are in some way or other 3D. Every single one. When clearly half of these games are there's nothing 3D about them. But it was such a strong buzzword. Like, you know, people craved and wanted and demanded 3D to such an extent that 2D games were being, in some cases, marketed as 3D, which is insane. Because it's in no way accurate or correct at all. But that, I mean, those were the
that's
times.
At best. At worst, it's like United, where it's like, yeah, we're not releasing 2D games. Like, I mean, that's really the reason why we didn't get a lot of 2D games on the play. Well, I mean, a lot of them for the PlayStation, the RU4 and Saturn. It's like, oh, no 2D, it's all 3D or nothing. And it's like, cool. So we have so many 2D games and RPGs that are stuck in Japan because of that mentality, and now we're just getting a lot of these, like the that what was the remake of that game, that Saturn game that just came out.
Atelier Marie, yeah.
Atelier Marie, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and like that's a consequence of that, is that we're getting all these games like unabashedly abridged and released, and it's just a sadness really that they could come to their senses back then, and we're missing so much stuff that either there's no source code or the company's defunct and we can't get it anymore.
Like if younger people are listening to this, because there are some younger Saturn fans, right? You know, if they're listening to this, I want you to know how much it cannot be understated the type of blinders we had on to anything 2D back then. The type of blinders that would cause Sega of America to opt not to put the Mobius hand-drawn artwork from the Japanese version of Panzer Dragoon, and instead use this butt ugly, pre-rendered 3D, dragon and everything like that on our cover of Panzer Dragoon. I mean, like, arguably now I might like it, ironically, like, okay, it's so ugly, it's good, kind of thing. But I mean, it is butt ugly. You had this amazing hand-drawn artwork by Mobius, who inspired the entire series Panzer Dragoon with his Arzac, French comic Arzac, and again, it's just one more example of them not bringing over Japanese artwork from the Japanese box arts just because, it won't sell as well. Americans are just, they've got the 3D glasses on and everything has to be 3D or they won't even give it the time of day, you know?
You know what would have been the biggest misconception if they did that is police knots, because on the cover for the US, remember, it was the robot walker on the moon in 3D?
Yes. Uh-huh.
Imagine that dropped in, like, what is this 2D BS?
Right.
Yep.
Exactly.
Yep.
You know, you had you and I think you said this well in the magazine, Peter, in the introduction letter, is that at that time the Saturn really had all of these just fantastic 2D experiences that represented how far the genre had come, like how far 2D gaming had really come, to the point, and the Saturn was a piece of hardware that was built around showcasing that.
Mm-hmm.
And yet it just came in this awkward period of time where gamers were really prejudiced towards 2D gaming and really just wanted the future, you know, which would, I mean, today I would say what would the equivalent be? Maybe VR, but it wasn't even to that extent. You know, not everybody cares about VR these days, but everybody cared about just how much more polygons a machine could push or how much better textures it was, you know. It was crazy.
Everything.
It was really crazy. And it was terrible that games were reviewed simply by the merit of whether or not they were 2D or 3D, you know?
Yeah, and that's the reason why, like I was saying before, there's so many low ratings for 2D games and all this stuff. It's like,
Mhm.
I mean, like you play these games now, like these games are like 2, 3 out of 5s. Like, this game is fantastic. How could people say that this was a 2 or 3 out of 5 game? This is, you know, a 5 out of 5.
There were a couple publications that knew what was up, you know. Game Fan, those guys, they all imported games. They loved Marvel versus Capcom. They loved all of the Capcom fighting games and stuff, and games like Radiant Silvergun and stuff, you know, and also OSSM, you know, to a degree, I would say, official Sega Saturn magazine. A lot of those guys knew what was up, and they would, sometimes they made mistakes, but I would say for the most part they would give 2D games a fair shake, you know. Sometimes they still fell subject to, you know, oh, it's 2D. But for the most part, you know, they would import games, so they knew how to appreciate a 2D game, you know, even back then.
Yep. Oh yeah, I mean, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, when it came out on PlayStation, did not sell well in North America.
That's crazy. That's crazy.
And it's one of the best games of that generation, right? So
It's
I mean, it is
beautiful.
what it is. Those were the
Yeah.
times.
I'm glad my dad bought that game when he did. Like he bought it and brought it home, and he was like, this is special. Like, look at the graphics, look at the music. Like, you just don't get very many 2D games that are able to impress so much like that. And it did combine some 3D graphics, right? It did.
It had, yep.
But it
Yeah,
was mostly
even the save thing, I think, is a 3D object. That's
right,
save.
right.
Yeah.
Sphere.
Right. But I mean, it was just truly a special game. You knew it back then. You knew that this was like the exception, not the rule, you know, when it came to games like that were so lovingly crafted like that one, you know?
Yeah, no, and I'm lucky I got, like, even when I did, like, I paid like $60 for it, and it jumped like immediately to 120, and it's like, dang, like it's just a game that, honestly, it's probably one of the best games. Like, I mean, I must have beat that game like 3 or 4 times already. It's just that good.
So for Saturn fans these days, they know that it's like you're getting the pinnacle of 2D, and all the stuff that we love that's 3D, we're kind of accepting it, understanding that it was just, you know, it was still
nascent.
getting its running legs, right? You know, it was just very nascent. Exactly. Great.
And don't get us wrong, we love 3D games as well. Like, I mean, Pan's Dragoon is some of the best. All those games are some of the best games ever released. Like, there's some really good 3D games, but like to us, like, it's just like, I think we're more salty that it just didn't get the fair shake that it deserved, the 2D games.
I just marvel at the fact that Saturn is creating all of its 3D using sprites, you know, at the end of the day, you know, warping sprites. And I mean, that doesn't make me think poorly of the machine. That makes me think even better of the machine, because I'm like, this thing is just such an impressive machine when it comes to its ability to move 2D sprites around, you know?
All right, everyone. So as we come to the end of the cast, just, you know, want to give a shout out to all of our patrons. I'll start with our VIP patrons: A Murder of Crows, Blue Moon 95, Emerald Nova, Ioannis Fetz, and Nate Lawrence. And also our All Access patrons: Ceralian, Chris 1997XX, Derek Pascarella, Fat Drunk Friend Otaku, Gen Clasher Rank, Ian Keg, Justin, Mamdou Madwar, Normal Guy, Nutrageous, Robert Ramsey, Rowan Dinch, Sega Steve, Stoneman, Tanuki Trev, Theron Brown, and Young Money Sway. And again, just a massive thanks, you guys. It is because of your support that we're able to continue to do what we do. We wouldn't be able to produce all of this content if it wasn't for what you guys are doing to support us. So just a massive, massive thank you from all of us.
2D platformers during the 32-bit generation were sort of like the ugly stepchild, right? They were there, and they were maybe at the peak of what they were, because you had the 32-bit machine's power and the expanded color palette, and you're able to suddenly put in amazing music, and games could be longer, and more settings, more modes, etc. But they were ignored because everybody wanted 3D. Everybody wanted the latest fighting game, the latest 3D platformer. And it wasn't until, I feel, much, much later, much after the 32-bit/64-bit sort of generation came and went, it wasn't until then that these games really started being appreciated for what they are. And that could be why copies of games like Rayman now are relatively expensive, None of the games on this list, with the exception of maybe Clockwork Knight, are really all that cheap. They were on the pricier side for sure. But yeah, the Saturn was a 2D machine. It was built for this kind of stuff, and I think that the games that we did get were really, really well done. All right, that brings us to the end of the cast. We hope that you've enjoyed listening to us talk about Astal and Clockwork Knight and Gex and Rayman. And a whole bunch of other 2D Saturn platformers, as well as Tryrush Deppy. It was a fun time. We thank you, everybody, for listening. And, as we head out, we just want each and every one of you to remember, you must play Sega Saturn. So long, folks.
See ya.
Later.
Bye.
Okay, I'm just gonna, for the outtakes this episode, I just feel like I need to give a little bit of context here. So initially, Nick was supposed to be recording with us as well, but due to some last minute scheduling, that just wasn't able to happen. But we did ultimately record a cheesy intro for him too, so we're going to play that for you now, because it would just be such a shame for that to be lost, to the annals of time. So yeah, so enjoy this unused intro for Nick.
Next, hailing from a long-forgotten branch of the animal kingdom, he is part man, part beast, and all panda all the time. We've got Nick, so welcome, Nick.
This podcast is a SHIRO Media Group production.
セガサターンシュ